Hey everybody, it's Mr. Verzat. We're going to create a value painting. Value painting is a great way to learn how to paint because color translates into value. Before you start your environment, I'd encourage you always go start with a wide variety of thumbnail sketches. Get yourself kind of geeking out and really thinking about the layout, the composition, the shapes and the forms, and nobody ever has to see these. What's going to happen is a meteorite impacts, and then in the crater, a big, terrifying, techno-organic alien life form starts to assimilate all the rock and dirt and grow out from this area. The military is going to come to the edge of the crater and try to annihilate it. But in other paintings that you've seen me do, that doesn't work out so well. It ends up overgrowing the area, and this particular country falls. So using this thumbnail, the only skills that were part of that would be just your basic sketching skills, your basic environment fundamentals that we learned from the previous video, and also the rule of thirds, just to break up the composition and try to pinpoint some focal points. Now the next stage to do this is to block in your environment. And for you students working on our exercise coming up, I'd encourage you to work small, meaning this tiny little 2" by 4" thumbnail, and start to block in the sky and the ground. And it's generally faster because with one stroke, you can cover like a quarter of the canvas. If I were zoomed in, I'd be all focused on details, and that's not the purpose at this early stage. We want a clean foundation laid first. I used manual opacity for control. That would be numbers 1 through 0, and I layered. Layering just means dropping down a plane and then painting over that plane with a new one, and then as things get progressively closer, adding another plane and another one, and so on. Now with the sky and the ground in place, I used a soft edge brush to control the light. Right over here, I wanted the viewer to look in this area, have these tanks and soldiers silhouetted. Most of the gunfire is going to converge on this point, so I wanted it to be bright and I wanted the alien to be silhouetted in front of it. Techniques I used were silhouette, lassoing, that means you draw with your lasso tool and then push with atmosphere. I used directional brushwork in order to capture the coiling of the tendrils. I used atmospheric perspective to have dark in front and progressively lighter as it goes back, and scale, specifically repetition. So we have a figure here, and a smaller figure, smaller figure, smaller figure, and we can kind of gauge the distance in this image. It puts the viewer in the shot. Now still working small, not zooming in. Shrink your brush size down and just continue blocking in your values on each form with a 1, 2, 3 read. So that's just basic lighting. I used on-screen mixing. Edge control was a major focus for this one too. I really wanted the tendrils to read, so I made sure that I used a strong brush that's hard-edged to make each form stand out. And once I was happy with the overall composition, it looks pretty good zoomed out, but it's not detailed yet. At this point, the foundation is laid, everything's in place, all we have to do is upscale and detail from there. So what is detailing? This is a timeline of the general workflow that you see with digital painting. If we look at the timeline from beginning to end, we have this chunk of time here where kind of getting the foundation laid is the major focus, and that's what we've just been looking at. Now your largest gains are going to happen in this time period, and this is about 20% of the time from beginning to end with the painting. You go from nothing to something very quickly, and once you transition to this stage, which is detailing, that you see the fewest gains over time, and it takes about 80% of the time to get the painting finished. Feel free to pause the video and look at these techniques that are highlighted. What detailing is cleaning every element in the image. The really cool thing about digital painting is that it's very forgiving. Here's the front part of this big snake-like, worm-like sea monster that I was painting. Now I wanted to add the body to it as a tentacle going off into the distance, like this. And you can see this is your typical block-in. See the curvature of the strokes? It's just a solid gray mass, and with some slightly curved strokes for the underbelly that would be the core shadow. Got a 1, got a 2, got a 3, and got some bounce starting to show in there too. Detailing and cleaning takes it up to a totally new level. What happened between this stage right here, let's just look at the tentacle, and this stage right here is no different. The same 1, 2, and 3 that I was working on earlier, I just did it at a smaller scale for, say, like this area right here. Shrank my brush down, tightened up the strokes, added some little details and designs and stuff, and then some texture overlay as well. So fundamentally, This is not really much different than this. Do this on a big scale, do it again on a smaller scale. All detailing is looking at an individual area and giving it those block-in tricks that you were already using on a larger scale. Let's take a look at this area right here. All I did was block in a jelly-like orb and then just add a 1, 2, 3 read to all these different little pieces. And if you want to go photoreal, you could zoom way in and keep doing that to individual elements again and again and again. The only problem is if you over detail, two major things happen. The piece starts to look dead. Also, most of those tiny details that I worked on would not be visible if the piece was meant to be seen from this distance. They'll disappear. Our eyes can only pick up so much information. So do consider how big the piece is, how far away your viewers are intended to see it, and detail a couple of steps in from where it's intended to be seen. Otherwise, it's just wasting time. So you see the detail is spreading throughout the image, just like the infectious disease. And the techniques that I used for that were mainly defining hard edges, refining soft edges, putting light next to dark. Other techniques, subsurface scattering on these jelly parts, ambient occlusion on the wrinkles, rim lighting with the shiny bits that start to curve away, and again, hard edge, soft edged value controls. You can learn these in any drawing class. You'll notice that this part of the monster is really loose to the point where we can't really define where all the forms are. I mean, there's a mass here, and there's a mass here, there's a mass here, and that's about it. Well, when you're in situations like this, just let your brain take over, color sample from these values that already exist, and start to pull out areas and push areas back. These little extra strokes that are sticking out, those could become tendrils coming out of this monster. And so we're clarifying, we're refining, and we're defining. And in the end, I added post-production effects, so to show that this creature is lunging forward and in motion. There's some motion blurs added. I selectively removed parts of the blurs, like around here, around forward-facing edges that are moving, to really kind of help us define it. Added some noise, and I think I'm going to go in and darken these areas up over here so that we can really see the main opposition, so that we can really see the gunfire, and also a little darkness over here would help push our eye back to the center where all this light is. So let's take a look at some detailing sped up. So this is a sped up version of the detailing process. All it is just extracting forms using a 1, 2, 3 read. And you see most of these forms are just cylinders at different angles. Using the light direction, I'm applying light areas next to dark areas just to pull them out. I'm using a chalk brush at 80 or 90% opacity, and you can tell the brush is really small. I'm just going in there, applying some value, and then adding hard edges and soft edges. Being very careful not to use white, because if you overdo white, it really burns out the image. I usually try to add that last. Right down here, I'm using expressive strokes where they get thick and thin, because this is an asymmetrical organic mass. These are actually very easy to do because it's kind of hard to screw it up. All you need to do is just add some light, add some texture, some rough brush strokes, and then your viewer is going to go, oh yeah, that's a gross slug-looking thingamajig. So it's the hard parts are when you're drawing symmetrical objects. I'm doing some bounce light right here, and I'm sampling from some of the areas underneath. The stroke direction is important as well. And you see, it's just a block-in. Refining and clarifying different areas. Now with the bulk of this mass clearly defined, I'm going in and doing the exact same thing, even at one more zoom in step closer. And I think this could be a little bit too close, in my opinion. But I'm just going back in and thinking, all right, what are some areas that need more action? What are some areas that might have too much action? Where do I want people to look? And how do I control that using light and dark? Pressure sensitivity is on my brush, so when I want a thin little area, I just draw very lightly, and it creates nice little wrinkles. These are tiny little highlights where you just kind of ding, 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 put them in. Makes things really pop. Do that at the end, just like you're waiting for dessert. Now here I'm cleaning up the silhouette, adding a couple extra tendrils, getting rid of these big janky strokes, and you see digital paint is very forgiving. Got something you don't like, just paint over it. Grab the background, sample it, and drop in a silhouette. Add a 1, 2, 3 read on those. And don't get too attached to things. A lot of this is going to go away when I start to add some motion blur effects. So here's the same process. I do some big jelly eyes, so drop in a mid-tone, paint in that subsurface scattering pattern that happens with transparent objects, and then give it a little rim light and a small highlight on the top. What I'm doing here is lassoing out an area and giving it motion blur, and then going in and erasing some of the hard edges that are going forward so that they're clearly defined. And I'm leaving some of the blur effects that are going behind or trailing behind the form, just to suggest that it's moving forward. We do the same thing here for this big thing that I just worked so hard on. Some of the effects are going to go away, but that's okay. That's part of the process. And then with the soft edge brush for an eraser at a low opacity, this way you can selectively remove some of the areas that you want the viewer to focus on. And I'm doing that for these dark and light areas where the eyes are located at. So add the blur effect and then selectively get rid of portions of it. I turn it off and on intermittently to test the effect to make sure it's working right. I'm thinking this is a more stable part of the creature, so it's not going to be moving as fast as, say, one of these tendrils flying forward. So I want some of those details to show a little bit. Going to do the same thing, going to do a value push here. I figured those two areas were too dark, and so I used the lasso tool to protect an edge, and then just push some of it back with some atmosphere, some light. And here you're just seeing pretty much the same thing with the motion blur effect. I'd consider this a post-processing effect. So if you plan on doing this, do spend your time wisely. If you've got details that will go away because of this, don't get too hung up on photorealism. You might just need a few major block-ins, and then the blur might make it look pretty real after the fact. Lastly, you can see that I'm doing it in segments because different parts are going in different directions. And don't be afraid to touch up as you go. Lastly, I can't emphasize it enough. Don't zoom in super close. It'll work against you if your piece is designed to be seen from a distance. So here's the work in progress, and students in class, we're going to add to this, and I'm going to demo these techniques live in front of you as you work on your pieces as well. I hope you guys found this helpful, and I look forward to seeing you guys in class. Take care.